The road stretched through the dry land like a faded ribbon, cutting across miles of dust, sagebrush, and old memories. The afternoon sun hung low over the desert hills, painting the rocks in deep shades of red and gold. Most travelers avoided this lonely road. It was the kind of place where the wind spoke louder than people, and the silence carried stories that had been forgotten long ago. A lone cowboy rode slowly along that road, his hat pulled low against the sun. His coat was worn from years of hard work, and his boots carried the dust of many trails. The saddle creaked softly beneath him as his horse moved at an easy pace. He had spent most of the morning checking fences along the far side of his land, and now he was making his way home before night settled across the plains. The cowboy was not a man who rushed through life. Out here, time moved differently. The wind decided when a storm would come. The sun decided when the day would end. A man simply learned to move with it. His eyes stayed on the road ahead, but something unusual caught his attention. A shape lay on the side of the trail up ahead. At first he thought it was nothing more than an old blanket or maybe a pile of brush that had blown in from somewhere. The desert wind had a habit of moving strange things across the land. But as he rode closer, the shape became clearer, and the calm rhythm of the afternoon suddenly felt different. He pulled gently on the reins. His horse slowed to a stop. The cowboy sat still for a moment, staring. It was a horse. The animal lay on its side in the dirt near the edge of the road. Its coat was dusty and dull, and its body hardly moved except for the faint rise and fall of breathing. Marks along its side showed it had been through something rough. Whoever owned it had not been kind. The cowboy's jaw tightened. Out here, a horse was more than an animal. It was a partner. A man trusted his horse with his life. Seeing one left like this stirred something heavy inside his chest. He swung down from the saddle and stepped slowly toward the fallen horse. The desert wind brushed across the ground, moving strands of dry grass and dust around his boots. The horse's ears twitched faintly as he approached, which meant it was still alive. That was something at least. He knelt beside the animal. "Easy now," he said quietly. His voice carried the calm tone of someone who had spent most of his life around animals. The horse lifted its head just slightly before letting it fall back into the dirt again. It was too weak to move much. The cowboy studied the injuries carefully without rushing. The marks looked bad, but he had seen worse during long winters and rough cattle drives. What troubled him more was the fact that someone had simply left the horse here. A man who could do that was not a man to be trusted. The cowboy looked down the empty road in both directions. Nothing, no riders. No wagons, no dust cloud in the distance. Whoever had done this had been gone for a while. He sighed slowly. Taking care of a wounded horse was not a small job. It meant time, work, and supplies. It meant long nights and patience. Some folks might have just ridden on and told themselves there was nothing they could do, but the cowboy was not built that way. He reached out and rested his hand gently against the horse's neck. The animal flinched slightly, then relaxed as if it understood that the stranger meant no harm. "Well," the cowboy muttered quietly, "looks like you had yourself a hard road." The horse's breathing remained slow and shallow. Dust clung to its coat, and its legs looked stiff from lying too long in one place. The cowboy stood up and walked back to his own horse. He pulled a small canteen from his saddlebag and returned to the injured animal. Carefully, he poured a little water into his hand and let the horse drink from it. The animal responded weakly but gratefully. "Still got some fight left in you," he said. The sun continued to drop toward the horizon, stretching long shadows across the desert floor. Night would arrive before long, and temperatures would fall fast once darkness came. Leaving the horse here was not an option. The cowboy studied the animal again, thinking through the problem the way a rancher always did. Slowly, carefully. He could not ride both horses at the same time, and the injured one was far too weak to stand on its own. That meant he would have to find another way. He removed the rope from his saddle and tied it gently around the fallen horse, creating a simple support harness the best he could. It was not perfect, but it might help the animal stay upright if he could get it standing. The cowboy wiped sweat from his forehead and looked down at the horse. "All right," he said softly. "Let us see what you can do." He pulled carefully on the rope while guiding the horse's body. For a moment nothing happened. Then the horse struggled weakly, pushing its legs beneath itself. Dust rose from the ground as it tried to lift its weight. The effort seemed to drain every bit of strength it had left. The cowboy stayed patient. "Come on," he encouraged quietly. With a shaky motion, the horse finally managed to stand, though its legs trembled like thin branches in the wind. The cowboy kept one hand on the rope and the other against the horse's shoulder, steadying it. "There you go." For a few seconds the animal swayed, unsure if it could remain upright. But slowly it found its balance. The cowboy allowed himself a small nod. That was the first step. His ranch sat several miles away, tucked near a small line of cottonwood trees beside a narrow stream. It was not a fancy place. Just a weathered house, a barn, and a stretch of land that had been worked by honest hands for many years. But it was safe. And right now, safe was what the horse needed. He guided the injured animal slowly toward his own horse and tied the rope in a way that would allow the wounded one to follow without putting too much strain on its legs. The journey would be slow, very slow, but it was possible. Before climbing back into the saddle, the cowboy looked down the empty road once more. Something about the situation bothered him. Horses did not simply end up beaten and abandoned in the middle of nowhere without a reason. Someone had done this. Someone who might still be riding these same lands. The wind whispered across the open desert again. The cowboy tightened his grip on the saddle horn and mounted his horse. "All right," he said quietly to the injured animal behind him. "Let us get you home." They began moving down the dusty road together, the healthy horse walking steadily while the wounded one followed with slow, careful steps. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky into deep shades of orange and purple. Long shadows stretched across the desert, and the distant mesas glowed like old fire under the fading light. It was a quiet ride, but the cowboy could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something bigger. As they traveled, he noticed something strange on the road ahead. Tracks. Fresh ones. Not from cattle. Not from wagons, horse tracks, several of them. They crossed the road and disappeared into the brush, not far from where he had found the injured animal. The cowboy slowed his horse again, his eyes narrowed as he studied the ground. The tracks were not old. They had been made recently, very recently, which meant whoever had left that horse might still be somewhere out there, hidden beyond the low hills and dry grass. The cowboy turned in the saddle and looked at the injured horse behind him. The animal followed quietly, unaware of the thoughts running through his mind. A long breath left his chest. "Well," he murmured to himself. The road home suddenly felt a little less peaceful than it had earlier that afternoon, because somewhere out in that open land, the men responsible for what happened to that horse might still be riding. And if they realized someone had taken the animal they left behind, they might come looking for it. Or worse, they might come looking for the man who rescued it. The cowboy nudged his horse forward again as the last light of the sun slipped behind the distant hills. Night was coming, and the quiet desert was about to hold more than just silence. Night settled over the desert faster than most people expected. One moment the land still held the warm glow of the sun, and the next the shadows grew long and cold. The cowboy kept his horse moving at a careful pace along the dusty road, listening to the quiet rhythm of hooves pressing into the ground. Behind him, the injured horse followed slowly, each step uncertain but determined. The wind had picked up a little, brushing across the open plains and carrying the dry scent of sagebrush through the air. Somewhere far off, a coyote called into the dark. The sound echoed across the land before fading into silence again. The cowboy kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but his mind stayed on the tracks he had seen earlier. They had not been the tracks of just one rider. There had been several horses, and they had crossed the road not far from where the wounded animal had been left behind. Whoever those riders were, they had not cared what happened to the horse once they were done with it. That thought sat heavy in his chest. He had lived in this part of the country long enough to understand the kind of men who sometimes passed through lonely places like this. Most folks who rode the plains were honest people trying to make a living, ranchers, traders, cattle drivers. But every now and then, a different kind of rider showed up, the kind that brought trouble with them. He glanced over his shoulder at the injured horse. Even in the dim light, he could see the animal's strength. The horse had good bones and a strong build under the dust and exhaustion. This had once been a fine animal. A horse someone should have valued, which made the situation even stranger. A man did not just abandon a good horse without a reason. They rode in silence for a long stretch of road. The cowboy let his horse choose a steady pace so the injured one would not fall behind. Every so often he would turn and check to make sure the animal was still managing to walk. Each time the horse kept going. That alone told him something about its spirit. After nearly an hour of slow travel, the shape of cottonwood trees finally appeared against the dark horizon ahead. Their branches swayed gently in the wind, marking the place where the small stream ran through the land. Home, the cowboy felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. The ranch was not large, but it had stood on that patch of land for many years. His father had built the place long before he was old enough to ride. Every board in the barn and every fence post carried the marks of long days of work. He guided the horses off the road and toward the narrow trail that led through the trees. The sound of running water soon reached his ears. The small stream moved quietly over smooth stones, reflecting the pale light of the rising moon. The ranch house sat a short distance beyond the trees, its wooden porch facing the open land. A lantern burned beside the door, casting a warm glow into the night. The cowboy slowed his horse as they approached the barn. The injured horse stumbled slightly as the ground shifted from hard dirt to softer earth near the corral. The cowboy dismounted quickly and walked back to steady the animal before it could fall. "Easy," he said softly. The horse breathed heavily but stayed upright. The cowboy opened the gate to the corral and led both animals inside. His own horse moved toward the water trough while the injured one remained standing where he left it, as if unsure where it belonged. The cowboy grabbed a lantern hanging near the barn door and lit it. The yellow light revealed the horse more clearly than the fading moonlight had allowed earlier. Dust covered most of its coat, but beneath that dirt the horse had a pale gray color with darker markings along its mane. Its body showed the signs of a long, rough journey. None of the injuries looked fresh enough to suggest the attack had happened that same day. This had been going on for a while. The cowboy ran a careful hand along the horse's side, checking for broken bones or swelling. "You are tougher than you look," he said quietly. The horse flicked one ear toward his voice. He led the animal slowly into the barn, where the wooden walls blocked the wind and held the warmth from the day. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and old wood. It was the kind of place where animals could rest without fear. The cowboy set the lantern on a hook and began preparing a small stall with fresh straw. The injured horse watched him the entire time. It seemed alert despite its exhaustion. That told him something else as well. This horse had not given up. Once the stall was ready, he carefully guided the animal inside and untied the rope harness. The horse lowered its head slowly as if relieved to finally stop moving. The cowboy filled a bucket with clean water and placed it nearby. The horse drank slowly but steadily. "That is a good sign," he murmured. He stepped back and studied the animal again. The marks along its body looked rough but not beyond healing. With rest and proper care, the horse could recover. It would take time, though. Days at least, maybe weeks. The cowboy leaned against the stall door, arms resting on the wooden rail. His thoughts drifted back to the tracks on the road. Whoever had ridden through that area had been moving together. A group of riders traveling with purpose. That usually meant one of two things out here: a cattle drive, or men who did not want to be easily stopped. The cowboy walked out of the stall and closed the gate carefully. He stepped outside the barn and looked toward the dark stretch of land beyond the ranch. The moon had risen high enough to cast pale light across the fields. The fences stood in long lines across the ground, and the wind continued to move quietly through the grass. Everything looked peaceful, but he knew better than to trust peaceful appearances. His ranch sat several miles from the nearest town, which meant travelers sometimes passed through the area on their way north or south. Most of them never caused trouble. Still, the memory of those tracks refused to leave his mind. He walked toward the small porch of the ranch house and sat down on the wooden steps. The old boards creaked beneath his weight. From where he sat, he could see the barn door and the faint glow of the lantern inside. The injured horse would be safe there for the night. But the question remained, why had someone treated the animal that way? The cowboy removed his hat and wiped his forehead with the sleeve of his coat. The night air had cooled, but the long day still lingered in his bones. He had lived most of his life on that ranch. After his father passed away, the responsibility of the land had fallen to him. It was not always easy work. Drought seasons had come and gone. Storms had broken fences and scattered cattle across miles of open land. But the ranch had survived, and so had he. Life on the frontier taught a man many things. It taught patience. It taught strength. And it taught him when something was not right. The situation did not feel right. The cowboy leaned forward slightly, listening to the quiet sounds of the night. The horses in the corral shifted their weight softly. The stream continued its slow movement through the trees. Somewhere in the distance another coyote called. Then he heard something else. A faint sound far beyond the edge of his land, hoof as the cowboy straightened immediately. The sound was distant, but it was there, more than one horse. Riders moving across the plains in the darkness. He stood up slowly and stepped off the porch, walking a few paces toward the open land. The sound faded for a moment, then returned again on the wind. Someone was riding through the night. That alone was not unusual in this country. Travelers sometimes pushed their horses after dark when they needed to reach shelter before morning, but the timing made him uneasy. The tracks on the road earlier that evening, the injured horse left behind. And now riders moving somewhere out there in the dark. The cowboy rested one hand on the fence post beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon. The moonlight revealed the open land clearly, but the riders were too far away to see. All he had was the sound, slow, steady, moving somewhere beyond the low ridge to the west. After a few minutes the sound faded completely, swallowed by the vast quiet of the plains. The cowboy remained standing there long after it disappeared. A strange feeling settled in his chest. He turned his head slightly toward the barn. Inside that barn stood a horse that did not belong to him. A horse that had clearly been part of something larger than a simple trail ride. And somewhere out there in the darkness were the men who had left it behind. The cowboy finally walked back toward the porch, but sleep would not come easily that night. Because deep down he had the strong feeling that the wounded horse in his barn had carried more than just a rider before. It had carried a story, and sooner or later that story was going to find its way to his ranch. The night grew quiet again after the distant sound of hooves faded into the open plains. The cowboy remained standing near the porch for a long moment, his eyes searching the moonlit land. Nothing moved out there now except the slow wind drifting through the grass. Still, the sound he had heard was real. Riders had passed somewhere beyond the low ridge, and the timing of it stayed in his mind. He finally stepped inside the house and lit the oil lamp sitting on the wooden table. The warm light pushed away the shadows that had settled in the corners of the small room. The ranch house was simple but strong, built from thick boards that had held up against years of desert storms. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a stove rested in the corner, and a worn chair sat beside the window that looked toward the barn. The cowboy poured himself a small cup of water and sat down slowly. Out here, a man learned to listen to his instincts. And right now his instincts were telling him that the injured horse in his barn was tied to something bigger than he first thought. He leaned back in the chair and stared toward the window. The barn lantern still glowed softly through the darkness. The horse inside was probably resting now after the long struggle to reach the ranch. But the marks on its body had not been the kind that came from a simple fall or accident. Someone had pushed that animal far beyond what it should have been asked to do, and then they had left it. The cowboy rubbed his chin thoughtfully. That kind of thing did not sit well with him. He had grown up around horses. His father used to say that a man could learn a lot about another man by the way he treated an animal. A rider who respected his horse usually carried that same respect into the rest of his life. But a man who would abandon a horse in pain on the side of the road was the kind who left trouble wherever he went. The cowboy stood up and stepped back outside. The night air had grown cooler. The stars stretched wide across the sky, shining clearly over the empty land. The moon hung high above the ridge, lighting the path that led from the ranch toward the road where he had found the horse. He walked toward the barn again. Inside, the injured horse lifted its head slightly when he entered. The lantern light flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows across the stall. "Just checking on you," the cowboy said quietly. The horse shifted its weight but remained calm. He stepped into the stall slowly and ran a gentle hand along the animal's neck. The horse seemed to relax under the touch. Its breathing had steadied, though it still looked tired. "You have been through quite a bit," he murmured. The cowboy studied the horse again, noticing details he had missed earlier. The saddle marks on its back were deep, showing that it had carried weight for many long miles without proper rest. There was also something else that caught his attention: a faint brand on the horse's side. He leaned closer to the lantern light. The brand had been partly covered by dirt and dust, but he could make out its shape now. It looked like two simple lines crossing each other, forming a rough symbol. The cowboy frowned slightly. He had seen many brands in his life. Every ranch had its own mark to show ownership of cattle and horses, but this one did not match any brand he recognized from the nearby ranches. That meant the horse likely came from far away, or from someone who did not care much about official records. The cowboy stepped back out of the stall and rested his arms on the wooden rail again. "You might have traveled a long road to end up here," he said quietly. The horse flicked its tail once and lowered its head again. After a few minutes, the cowboy left the barn and returned to the house. Sleep came slowly that night. Each time he closed his eyes, the same thoughts returned: the tracks on the road, the distant riders, the strange brand on the horse. By the time morning light began to creep over the horizon, he was already awake. The sky turned pale blue as the sun rose over the mesas. The desert warmed quickly, and the wind carried the dry scent of the plains once again. The cowboy stepped outside with a cup of coffee and walked toward the corral. The injured horse stood quietly in its stall when he entered the barn. It looked a little stronger than the night before. The long rest had helped. "Morning," the cowboy said. The horse lifted its head and watched him. He filled the bucket with fresh water and brought a small portion of hay. The horse ate slowly but with steady interest. That was another good sign. While the animal rested, the cowboy stepped back outside and looked across his land. The fences ran straight along the fields, and the stream continued to move gently through the cottonwood trees. Everything looked normal, but the quiet morning did not remove the feeling that something was still moving behind the scenes. Later that morning, the cowboy saddled his horse and rode out toward the road where he had found the injured animal. He wanted to take another look at the tracks while the daylight made them easier to see. The ride took nearly an hour. When he reached the spot, he dismounted and studied the ground carefully. The tracks were still visible in the dry dirt. Several horses had crossed the road there, just as he remembered. The prints were clear enough to show that the riders had been moving quickly. But there was something else now: fresh marks. The cowboy crouched lower and brushed the dirt aside with his hand. Someone had returned during the night. The new tracks circled the area briefly before heading west across the open land. He stood slowly, his expression tightening. Whoever those riders were, they had come back looking for something or someone. The cowboy looked toward the distant hills where the tracks disappeared. A quiet tension settled over him. The men who had abandoned that horse had clearly realized it was gone, and now they were searching the area where they had left it, which meant one thing: sooner or later they might start checking nearby ranches. The cowboy mounted his horse again and turned toward home. As he rode, his thoughts moved through different possibilities. Maybe the riders were nothing more than rough travelers passing through the territory. Maybe the injured horse had simply collapsed during a hard journey and the group had moved on. But the marks on the animal's body told a different story, and the way those riders had returned during the night suggested they were not finished with whatever business had brought them there. Back at the ranch, the cowboy unsaddled his horse and walked straight to the barn. The injured horse stood quietly where he had left it. For a moment he simply watched the animal. "You may have brought trouble to my door," he said softly. The horse shifted its ears. The cowboy walked into the stall again and studied the faint brand once more. 2 crossing lines, simple but unfamiliar. He stepped back and leaned against the stall gate. Somewhere out on those plains were riders who had lost a horse they clearly expected to find again. Riders who were now searching the land. And now that horse stood safely inside his barn. The cowboy let out a slow breath. He had faced difficult situations before. Ranch life had a way of bringing challenges without warning. But something about this situation felt different. This felt like the beginning of a larger story. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing through the trees near the stream. The cowboy stepped out of the barn and looked toward the road one more time. Far in the distance, near the edge of the horizon, he noticed a faint cloud of dust rising into the sky. Someone was riding this way, and whoever it was, they were coming straight toward his ranch. The cloud of dust on the horizon grew slowly as the minutes passed. At first, it was only a faint blur rising above the dry land, something a man could almost ignore if he wanted to believe it was just the wind playing tricks across the trail. But the cowboy knew better. He had spent too many years watching the open plains to mistake the movement of riders. He stood near the barn, one hand resting against the wooden rail, his eyes fixed on that distant dust. Someone was coming, and they were coming straight toward his ranch. The injured horse shifted inside the stall behind him, the quiet sound of hooves against straw breaking the stillness inside the barn. The cowboy glanced back at the animal for a moment before looking toward the horizon again. If those riders were the same men whose tracks he had seen earlier, then they were likely searching for the horse, which meant the quiet life on this small ranch was about to be interrupted. The cowboy walked slowly out of the barn and toward the house. The morning sun had climbed higher now, lighting the dry grass and casting long shadows across the land. Everything around him looked calm and ordinary, but he could feel the tension rising in the air. Inside the house, he placed his hat on the table and poured another cup of coffee. He drank it slowly while standing near the window that faced the road. The dust cloud had grown larger. Now he could make out shapes within it. 3 riders, maybe 4. They were still far enough away that their faces could not be seen, but their direction was clear. They were following the same road that led directly past the place where the injured horse had been found. The cowboy set the cup down. His thoughts moved carefully through the situation. Running from trouble had never been his way. This ranch was his home, built by his father's hands and kept alive by years of hard work. If strangers were coming, they would find him here. Still, that did not mean he had to greet them without caution. He stepped outside again and walked toward the barn. The injured horse lifted its head when he entered. "You might be the reason visitors are on their way," he said quietly. The horse watched him with tired but alert eyes. The cowboy checked the stall gate and made sure everything was secure. The horse would remain safe inside the barn for now. After that, he stepped outside and walked to the corral where his own horse stood waiting. He saddled the animal slowly, his movements calm and practiced. The leather straps tightened, the saddle settled into place, and the familiar rhythm of ranch work helped steady his mind. By the time he finished, the riders were close enough that the shapes of their hats and coats could be seen clearly. 4 men, they rode in a loose line, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. The cowboy mounted his horse and guided it toward the open space in front of the ranch house. He did not ride to meet them on the road. Instead, he stopped near the fence where he could watch them arrive. The riders slowed when they noticed him. Even from a distance, the cowboy could see that these were not ordinary travelers passing through the territory. Their clothes were worn from the trail, and their faces looked hard in the bright sunlight. They studied the ranch carefully as they approached. The lead rider finally raised a hand and pulled his horse to a stop about 20 yards away. The other 3 riders stopped beside him. For a moment, nobody spoke. The wind moved softly across the land, rustling the grass near the fence line. Then the lead rider tipped his hat slightly. "Morning," he said. The cowboy nodded once. "Morning." The riders looked around the ranch again. Their eyes moved toward the barn, the corral, the small house, and the trees by the stream. The lead rider spoke again. "You live out here alone?" "Most days," the cowboy answered. The man nodded slowly as if considering the information. "We have been riding a long way this morning," he said. "Lost something along the road yesterday." The cowboy remained still in the saddle. "What kind of something?" The man glanced briefly at the others before answering. "A horse?" The word hung in the air between them. The cowboy could feel the tension building quietly beneath the conversation. The injured horse in the barn shifted again, though the riders could not hear it from where they stood. The lead rider continued speaking. "Gray horse," he said. "Strong animal. Might have wandered off during the night." The cowboy studied the man's face carefully. The rider spoke in a calm tone, but something about the explanation did not sit right. Horses did wander sometimes, that was true. But they rarely wandered after being left beaten on the side of a desert road. The cowboy rested his hand lightly on the saddle horn. "I saw a lot of empty road yesterday," he said. The other riders exchanged brief glances. The lead rider leaned slightly forward in his saddle. "You did not happen to see a horse along the trail?" The cowboy paused for a moment. He thought about the injuries on the horse's body, the deep saddle marks, the exhaustion. Then he answered carefully, "I saw something." The men grew very still. "What kind of something?" the rider asked. The cowboy met his gaze. "A horse that had been pushed too far." Silence settled again. The wind picked up slightly, lifting dust across the ground between them. One of the other riders shifted in his saddle and looked toward the barn again. His eyes lingered there a little longer this time. The lead rider's voice grew tighter. "Did that horse come this way?" The cowboy did not answer right away. His thoughts moved quickly now. The situation could turn in many directions depending on the next few words spoken. He finally nodded once. "Horse is resting in my barn." The riders immediately sat straighter. The lead rider's expression changed slightly, though he tried to keep his voice calm. "Well now," he said, "that saves us some trouble. We have been tracking that animal for a while." The cowboy studied the group again. Something in their tone suggested relief, but not the kind that came from caring about the horse's well-being. More like relief that they had found something they did not want to lose. The cowboy shifted his weight slightly in the saddle. "Horse needed help," he said. One of the riders let out a short laugh. "Horses need to work," the man muttered. The lead rider raised a hand slightly, quieting him. "We appreciate you looking after it," the lead rider said. "We will take it from here." The cowboy remained still. Behind him, the barn door creaked slightly in the breeze. For a moment no one moved, then the cowboy spoke. "Horse is not ready to travel." The riders exchanged another look. The lead rider sighed slowly. "That horse belongs to us," he said. "We will decide when it travels." The cowboy's eyes narrowed slightly. Out here on the frontier, ownership was not always as simple as a brand. A horse might belong to a rancher, a traveler, or someone who had taken it by force. The faint brand he had seen on the horse still rested in his mind. Two crossing lines. Unfamiliar, the cowboy looked from one rider to the next. "Funny thing," he said slowly. "I have seen a lot of brands over the years." The lead rider waited. "But that one on your horse does not belong to any ranch around here." The air between them grew colder. The riders shifted slightly again. One of them spoke under his breath, though the cowboy could not hear the exact words. The lead rider's eyes hardened just a little. "That horse is ours," he repeated. The cowboy glanced briefly toward the barn. Inside, the gray horse remained resting in the stall, unaware of the conversation unfolding outside. The cowboy turned his attention back to the riders. "Maybe," he said. The men waited for him to continue. But the way that horse looked yesterday did not say much about ownership. The wind moved across the plains again, stronger now. Dust lifted from the road behind the riders, drifting through the dry air. For several seconds nobody spoke. The tension between the two sides grew heavier with each passing moment. The lead rider slowly reached down and adjusted his grip on the reins. "We did not come here for trouble," he said. The cowboy gave a small nod. "Neither did I." One of the riders leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "Then bring the horse out," he said. The cowboy remained calm. "Horse needs rest." The rider's patience seemed to fade. "Bring it out." The cowboy did not move. Behind him, the barn stood quiet beneath the bright sun. The injured horse was still healing, still regaining its strength after whatever journey had nearly broken it. The cowboy knew one thing for certain. If those men took the horse now, it would not survive another hard ride. The lead rider watched him carefully. "Are you refusing to return our horse?" The cowboy felt the weight of the moment settling around them. The open plains stretched wide in every direction. The wind moved through the grass. The distant mesas stood silent under the afternoon sky. Everything seemed to hold its breath. The cowboy slowly lifted his eyes to meet the rider's gaze, and the next word spoken between them would decide what happened next. The cowboy slowly lifted his eyes to meet the rider's gaze. The wind brushed across the open plains, carrying the dry smell of dust and grass between the two sides. For a moment the land felt completely still, as if even the desert itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The cowboy sat steady in the saddle, his voice calm when he finally spoke. "I'm saying that horse is not leaving this ranch today." The lead rider studied him carefully. His jaw tightened slightly, though he tried to keep his tone controlled. "That horse belongs to us." The cowboy nodded once. "You said that already?" One of the men behind the leader shifted impatiently in his saddle. His horse stamped the ground, kicking up a little dust near the fence line. "We have been riding all morning," the man muttered. "Let us just take the horse and go." The cowboy's eyes moved across the group. None of them looked like men who had spent much time caring for animals. Their saddles were rough, their gear worn in a way that suggested long travel without much concern for the condition of their horses. Then his gaze returned to the leader. "You pushed that animal too far," the cowboy said quietly. "Any man who rides a horse like that does not deserve it." The words hung in the air. The lead rider leaned forward slightly in his saddle. "You do not know anything about us?" The cowboy shook his head slowly. "I know enough." The man exhaled through his nose and glanced toward the barn again. "We have business to finish," he said. "That horse is part of it." The cowboy felt the weight of those words. Part of it, not a partner. Not a living creature worth protecting. Just part of something. "What kind of business?" the cowboy asked. The men exchanged another look. The rider who had spoken earlier shifted again and finally answered. "We had a job. The horse slowed us down." The cowboy did not respond immediately, but the meaning behind those words became clearer. These men had pushed the horse during some kind of hard ride, likely across many miles. When the animal could no longer keep up, they had simply abandoned it. And when they realized the horse was gone, they came back searching. The cowboy rested his hands on the saddle horn. "Well," he said, "your job is not my concern." The lead rider's patience finally cracked. "You do not seem to understand," he said sharply. "That horse is ours, and we are leaving with it." The cowboy sat quietly for a moment, then shook his head again. "No." The simple word landed heavier than any long speech. The riders stiffened. The wind picked up slightly, lifting dust along the road behind them. The quiet ranch suddenly felt smaller under the weight of the moment. Then something unexpected happened. A voice called from the direction of the road. "Hold up there." Everyone turned. Another rider approached from the far end of the trail. Unlike the others, this man rode at a steady, unhurried pace. A star-shaped badge glinted on his coat in the sunlight, the local sheriff. The four riders shifted uncomfortably as the sheriff brought his horse closer. He stopped beside the cowboy and looked from one face to another. "Morning," the sheriff said calmly. The cowboy nodded. "Morning." The sheriff turned his attention toward the group of men. "Interesting gathering you have here." The lead rider forced a thin smile. "Just picking up our horse." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Is that right?" His gaze moved toward the barn, then back to the men. "I passed some tracks a mile down the road," the sheriff said slowly. "Looked like several horses moving in a hurry yesterday." The men stayed silent. The sheriff leaned back slightly in his saddle. "Also heard something from the next town over this morning," he continued. "A ranch reported a missing gray horse." The cowboy glanced toward him briefly. The sheriff continued speaking. "Seems that horse was taken a few days ago." Now the riders looked uneasy. The sheriff's voice remained calm, but there was a quiet authority behind every word. "Funny thing about brands," he added. "They tell a story." The cowboy thought of the faint brand he had seen earlier. 2 crossing lines. The sheriff looked toward the barn again. "That horse in there would not happen to have a strange brand on its side, would it?" The cowboy nodded once. The sheriff turned back to the riders. "Well now," he said, "that makes this conversation a little different." The lead rider shifted in his saddle. "You do not know anything about that horse." The sheriff gave a small smile. "Actually, I know quite a bit." The silence that followed felt heavy. The sheriff spoke again. "That horse belongs to a ranch family north of here." It went missing during a storm last week. Folks have been looking for it. The cowboy felt something settle inside his chest. So the horse had not belonged to these men after all. The sheriff's eyes narrowed slightly. And from the looks of things, he said, someone has been riding it pretty hard since then. The riders said nothing. The wind moved across the plains again. Finally, the lead rider exhaled and looked around as if measuring the situation. 4 riders against 2 men on a quiet ranch might have seemed like good odds earlier, but the sheriff's presence changed everything. And the open land had a way of carrying news quickly between towns. The man tightened his grip on the reins. "We do not want trouble," he said. The sheriff shrugged slightly. "That is good." Another long moment passed. Then the lead rider turned his horse slowly. "Come on," he muttered to the others. The group began moving back toward the road. None of them spoke again as they rode away, their horses kicking up dust along the same trail they had followed earlier that day. The cowboy watched them disappear across the open land. Only when the dust cloud faded into the distance did the tension finally begin to ease. The sheriff looked toward him and smiled faintly. "Seems you picked up quite a story yesterday." The cowboy let out a slow breath. "Just found a horse on the side of the road." The sheriff nodded. "Sometimes that is how stories start." They both turned toward the barn. Inside, the gray horse lifted its head as the 2 men entered. The sunlight filtered through the wooden boards, casting warm light across the stall. The sheriff stepped closer and examined the brand carefully. "That is the one," he said. The cowboy rested his arms on the stall rail. "Family north of here will be glad to see it again." The sheriff nodded. "They have a young boy who raised that horse from the time it was a colt." The cowboy smiled slightly. "Well then," he said, "that horse deserves a better ride home than the one it had before." Over the next several days, the gray horse slowly regained its strength. The cowboy cleaned its wounds, fed it carefully, and allowed it time to rest in the quiet safety of the barn. Each morning the horse stood a little stronger. Each afternoon it walked a little steadier. By the end of the week the animal was ready to travel again. The sheriff returned with a wagon one clear morning, and together they prepared the horse for the journey north. Before leaving, the cowboy rested his hand on the horse's neck one last time. "You gave us quite a story," he said softly. The horse flicked its ears and breathed calmly. The sheriff climbed into the wagon and tipped his hat. "Family will not forget what you did," he said. The cowboy shrugged slightly. "Just did what any man should." The wagon rolled slowly down the trail, carrying the gray horse back toward the ranch where it truly belonged. The cowboy stood near the fence watching until the wagon disappeared beyond the cottonwood trees. The ranch grew quiet again. The wind moved through the grass. The stream flowed beside the trees, and the open plains stretched wide beneath the bright sky. Life returned to its familiar rhythm, but the cowboy knew something important had happened during those few days. Sometimes the road placed small choices in front of a person: ride past a problem or stop and help. That one moment beside the dusty trail had changed everything for that horse. And maybe, in a quiet way, it had reminded the cowboy of something his father used to say long ago. A good man is not measured by how far he rides. He is measured by the moments when he chooses to stop. The cowboy adjusted his hat, turned toward the barn, and walked back to the work that waited on his ranch, knowing that somewhere out there a gray horse was finally heading home.